Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this Friday, last day of the week, August 18th, 2017 day on our calendar. And today we're going to talk about, well, first let me say this. Another false flag attack in Barcelona. You can bet that'll be the story on the internet tomorrow for all of the so-called conspiracy theorists. And the mainstream will cover it as if it really happened. Well, let's see what both sides of the story will tell us. Give it a little bit of time. It just happened about, 7-8 hours ago. I think that's the time frame. But anyway, go to my website at arcticbeacon.com, and you can get shows going back well over a decade regarding what I call the Vatican-led New World Order. And two things in the news. We have all of this this talk since Charlottesville. Now governors are saying, let's take down every statue that has anything to do with the Confederates. And nobody really understands what the Civil War was all about, really. And really, the Vatican and the monarchs of England were behind it and basically financed the Confederates. And so basically, if you're going to take down their monuments, you better take down all the Vatican church monuments, and every one of them in every state. That'd be a good place to start. But another thing that's been bugging me is this lack of people understanding that the powers that be, going all the way up to Rome, all roads lead to Rome, control both sides of an argument. And in fact, when we start talking about the Cold War and communism coming back, Nazism and all this stuff, they created both. Hitler was mentored by Pope Pius XII. Yes. And most of the top guys in the Nazi Party were all Catholics. It's, the little-known things in history that they keep from us. But talking about communism, so we hear this kind of discussion. People just don't get it. Well, they have this country, the communism, the communist forces are coming back, and we're being taken over. They control both sides. And we're going to go back today. Somebody sent me a good article. And I talk a lot about the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay and how they were creating communism back in the 1600s. And they were behind the communist movement. In fact, Stalin should be called the Jesuit priest. He was mentored by them. And I told you the story about Father Edmund Walsh from Georgetown, the creator of the diplomatic foreign service department there at Georgetown, and most of our diplomats are trained there to this day. And he's been given a page on Eisenhower's website, and basically he went to Lenin during the Bolshevik Revolution as an emissary of the Vatican, stating that they were going there to give food, when in fact he was going there with a pocket full of money from the Western bankers to support communism and to build up the Bolshevik Revolution. But one proviso: they had to let Stalin in to some of the top positions, and he eventually took over. And I went through a little bit of that yesterday. We can go back to a lot of my old stories, and I talk about it. But this article is interesting, and it's how the Jesuits perfected communism and the reductions of the Paraguay. It goes on to say that the history books haven't really told us the truth when being taught about communism. That I could tell you. The books we read in school tell us that communism was interpreted during the 19th century by Karl Marx. Boy, the little puppies are going crazy. These are the ones I'm trying to find a home for. A German philosopher of Jewish descent who advocated a classless and stateless society where the government controls all aspects of commerce and wealth. Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto in 1848, interpreting his version called the 10 Planks of Communism. Here they are, just for your reference. abolition of private property and land, and application of all rents of land to public purpose. And I think that's happening here today. A new heavy, progressive, and graduated income tax. That's happening here in the United States, and we're called a democracy. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. That'll soon be gone. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Boy, that sounds like America. Not much difference anymore, huh? Centralization of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state. Boy, are we talking about communism here or the United States? Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Equal obligation of all to work. Establishment of industry. That's here. We can all work in America, but you're not going to make much money if you work for somebody. Establishment of industrial armies. Sounds like here, especially for agriculture. Combination of agriculture and manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable, equal distribution of the population over the country. Free education for all children in government schools. Abolition of child factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production. Could these two men, Marx and Engels, perfect such an elaborate system of government just by contemplation? Where do you think they got this? Now let's look at Mein Kampf. You think Hitler wrote it. He never wrote it. It was written by a Jesuit priest named Father Stampfel. Now, perhaps the Jesuits had something to do with the writing of, this Communist Manifesto. Now, let's look deeper. I think not that Marx and Engels, I personally think the Jesuits had their hand in writing this, working with them. Could two men perfect such an elaborate system like I mentioned? What have we here is an attempt to cover up a trail and pin the conspiracy on Jewish origin. Communism was really created and perfected by the Jesuits in their reductions of Paraguay during the 17th and 18th century. Now, they entered Paraguay in the early 1600s, sent by the kings of Spain and Portugal. They established their supremacy over the natives called the Guarani Indians and did not allow them to mix with the Spanish or the Portuguese. It was among the people of the Jesuits established their communes called reductions. Richard W. Thompson, a former Secretary of the Navy, said, "The unsuspecting Indians were easily seduced by acts of kindness, and the result was that in the course of a brief period they succeeded in establishing a number of what we call reductions, or more properly speaking, villages with multitudes of Indians assembled about them, the whole aggregating in the end several 100,000. These 57 reductions constituted the Jesuit state, and were all, by the mere ceremony of baptism, conferred Roman papal citizenship and privileges and immunities. Brought under Jesuit dominion, the commune or reduction was kept in order to by the system of spying. Each reduction was governed by a Jesuit father, supported by a vicar and a curate as assistants, but whose chief duty was espionage. Universal equity prevailed. The principles of socialism and communism, very much as now understood, governed by these reductions. Everything necessary to the material comfort and prosperity of the Indians was in common. Each family had a portion of land set apart for cultivation. They also learned trades, and many of them, both men and women, became experts. But the earnings of the whole were deposited in common storehouses at each reduction and distributed by the Jesuits in such proportions to each individual as necessity required. Suffrage was universal, but the sanction of the Jesuits was necessary to the validity of the election. In order to teach the confiding Indians that obedience to authority was their chiefest duty, they were subjected to rules of conduct and intercourse, which were enforced with the strictest of severity. They were watched in everything. Sounds like here. There's eyes everywhere. You got cameras on every corner in America. They constituted, in fact, a state society reaching the Jesuit ideal completely. That is, docile, tractable, submissive, obedient workers, just like America, without the least real semblance of manhood. Having thus completed their subjugation, energetic measures were adopted to render any change in their condition impossible. The Jesuit Republic, as they called it, composed of 57 Paraguay reductions, was in fact a vast commercial empire in which over 200,000 slaves labored for their black-robed corporate masters. Now, these guys are supposed to be priests. How many times, people, are you going to listen, not listen to people who give you the truth about these people? I mean, why do you think the politicians go to them now? Because the Vatican's the richest organization in the world, and they're well trained and schooled in how to create governments, how to manipulate the population. They're experts at it. Do you think these stupid politicians are these people like Engels and Marx and who else? Hitler? Bush? All these people know anything about? No, they go to their masters here and they start learning from them. And the Clintons are basically, they'll tell you their mentors are Jesuit priests. So, it's pretty obvious. Now, this is what they constitute. There was a society of control. And what they're doing now, they're calling America free and a republic. But it's actually similar to what's going on here, isn't it? It's turning into that. By the control, by all the regulations, by all the stupid spying. Now, it composed this little test they were doing so they could bring it to Russia, was in fact a vast commercial empire using slaves. And that brings me to a point here, and I'll get back to this in a second, but I just thought of this. All these people now are clamoring, to take down all the Confederate statues and everything because we're not in slavery anymore, folks. We are all still slaves. Ever since the 14th Amendment made us slaves, and not only were black slaves back then, now we are. Everyone is. So don't get this idea that you're a free man. By no means at all are you a free person in this country. So these black-robed corporate masters, the Jesuits, there's a ex-Jesuit Irish priest named E. Boyd Barrett, and he said this: the Jesuits, as it is well known, held very large regions of Paraguay under missionary control from 1650 to 1750. More than 250,000 natives worked under their absolute direction, and no payment was made directly to them. They were educated, trained, housed, clothed, fed, and to some extent amused by what became the surplus profits of their labors and of extensive trading that was carried on. Over 2,000 boats are said to have been engaged in carrying merchandising goods on the Parana River, and the economic value of the reductions was beyond doubt very great, so great indeed as to have awakened the envy of Spanish and Portuguese traders. Robertson estimated that the reductions represented at least 25 million in capital for the society. That was back then. The most dramatic testimony to Jesuit eagerness for earthly goods, I thought they took a vow of poverty here, is contained in a letter from the Venerable Bishop Palafox of Los Angeles, Mexico, to Pope Innocent X, dated May 25, 1647. It treats the wealth of the Mexican Jesuits of that time. Most Holy Father, I found almost all the wealth, all immovables, all the treasures of this province of America in the hands of Jesuits who still possess them. 2 of their colleges have 300,000 sheep, without counting the small flocks, and whilst amongst all the Catholic churches and the orders together have hardly 3 sugar refineries. The society has 6 of the largest. One of these refineries is valued at more than 500,000 thalers, and this single province of the Jesuits, which however only consists of 10 colleges, possesses, as I have just said, 6 of these refineries, each of which brings in 100,000 thalers yearly. Besides this, they have cornfields of enormous size. Also, they have silver mines. And if they continue to increase their power and wealth as they have done up to now, the secular clergy will become indebted to them, and the laymen their stewards, while the other orders will be forced to collect alms at their doors. All this property and all these considerable revenues, which might make a sovereign powerful, serve no other purpose than to maintain 10 colleges, military fortresses. To this may be added the extraordinary skill with which they make use of this abundant wealth. They maintain public warehouses, cattle fairs, butcher stalls, and shops. They send part of their goods by way of the Philippine Islands to China. They lend out their money for usury and thus cause the greatest loss and injury to others, as they do in the United States today. They're doing the same thing via their huge private banks, one of them being Bank of America. From 1609 to 1767, the Jesuits were able to perfect the 10 planks of communism by subjugating the Guarani Indians of their labor for 158 years, using the wealth they accumulated to finance the advancements of global control up to the present. When the time was right, they would overthrow the Protestant countries in Europe and then implement the 10 planks of communism after numerous war devastated the land and people. Very, very interesting, isn't it? The Jesuit reductions in Paraguay. Okay, so let's move on from the Jesuit reductions in Paraguay and look a little bit at world history. And let's look at Jesuit treachery at its finest. I love these stories. And I've talked much about this stuff. But the greatest tragedies, folks, in the last 200 years can be traced to the Jesuits. But nobody wants to believe it. You know, they get away with anything. It's incredible. And I want to show you that the Jesuits planned and carry out also the sinking of the Titanic. And I was sent an article. I've done many shows on this. And there are many, many theories. But let's look at this one. Since the early 1830s, America did not have a central bank. The Jesuits desperately wanted another central bank in America so that they would have a bottomless reservoir from which to draw money for their many wars and the hideous schemes around the world. So what does it have to do with the Titanic? Is it just that Hollywood blockbuster movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? A romance and love story happened on the ship voyage from England to America? That's all people in America know about it. You know, they whistled that song. Well, it's not the real story, or perhaps just it's not even part of the story. What you read about that is just Hollywood fiction. The information that I'm going to give you today is much more important, and they ought to make a movie on this. Imagine if you try to make a movie on the real sinking of the Titanic, how far that would get. But in 1910, 7 men met on Jekyll Island, just off the coast of Georgia, to establish a central bank, which they called the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, folks, the Federal Reserve is not federal, okay? It's private foreign banks that are printing our money, and then they charge us great interest on it, and we're never going to get out of debt. That's what they don't want us to get out. This is going to be the sinking of America, not just the sinking of the Titanic. These men were Nelson Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip, both representing the Rockefeller financial empire. Henry Davison, Charles Norton, and Benjamin Strong. Now they represented J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg representing the Rothschild banking dynasty of Europe. We have already seen that the Rothschilds were the banking agents for the papacy's Jesuits. So the Vatican is the boss of the Rothschilds. So when these conspiracy theorists start saying that the Rothschilds control everything, the Rockefellers, no, they're just the bankers. Who has the power? The guys with the money. They tell them what to do. They're agents of the Jesuits, holding the key of the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. Yep. Now, The meeting took place on Jekyll Island, and the Jesuits were basically organizing this. The Morgans were friendly competitors with the Rothschilds and became socially close to them. Morgan's London-based firm was saved from financial ruin in 1857 by the Bank of England, over which the Rothschilds held great influence. Thereafter, Morgan appears to have served as a Rothschild financial agent and went to great length to appear totally American. His Rockefeller entry into the field was not welcomed by Morgan. I better check the time here because yesterday I went over. Got about 4 minutes, so I will continue. These three financial families, well, anyway, let me get back. His Rockefeller entry into the field was not welcomed by Morgan, and they became fierce competitors. Eventually, they decided to minimize their competition by entering into a joint venture. In the end, they worked together to create a national banking cartel called the Federal Reserve. G. Edward Griffin wrote about that in The Creature from Jekyll Island. Now, these three financial families, Rothschilds, Morgans, and Rockefeller, all do the bidding of the Jesuit order because of the Jesuit infiltration in their organizations. They do whatever is necessary to destroy constitutional liberty in America and to bring the Pope to world domination. As we look back over the 20th century, we see how successful the Jesuits have been. They have continued to squander the wealth of America and continually attack its great constitution and civil liberties. Daily, the power of the Pope and the Vatican increases. One day, they will achieve total power again. The building of the Titanic began in 1909 at a shipyard in Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland. Belfast was a Protestant haven and was hated by the Jesuits. World War I began just a few years later. Now, the Titanic was one of a fleet of ships owned by the White Star Line. Okay, now remember that. Okay, and let me check the time, so I don't want to go over. Okay, I got 2.5 minutes. Now, the Titanic was one of a fleet of ships owned by the White Star Line, an international shipping company. Banking was not only a business in which Morgan had a strong financial interest. Using his control over the nation's railroads as financial leverage, he had created an international shipping trust, which included Germany's two largest lines plus one of the two in England, the White Star Lines. There were a number of very rich and powerful men who made it abundantly clear that they were not in favor of the Federal Reserve System. J.P. Morgan was ordered by the Jesuits to build the Titanic. This unsinkable ship would serve as the death ship for those who opposed the Jesuits' plan for the Federal Reserve System. These rich and powerful men would have been able to block the establishment of that system. So remember that. And we've talked about this before on a couple shows that I did a number of years ago. These rich men in power would have been able, again, to block the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and their power and fortunes had to be taken out of their hands. They had to be destroyed by a means so preposterous that no one would ever suspect they were murdered, and no one would suspect the Jesuits. Nobody exists. It'd be amazing to see how many assassinations they've been behind. The Titanic was the vehicle of their destruction. In order to further shield the papacy and the Jesuits from suspicion, many Irish, French, and Italian Roman Catholics immigrating to the New World were aboard. They were people who were expendable. Protestants from Belfast who wanted to immigrate to the United States were also invited on board. Yes. So anyway, we're going to stop it right there. See, even the faithful and Roman Catholic people were betrayed by the Jesuits. Irish, French, and Italian Roman Catholics aboard the Titanic perished in the middle of cold water in the Atlantic Oceans. Do you think they care? People are, folks, expendable. Very expendable. And they'll go against their own. Well, listen, I'm going to take a break right now for 3 minutes and then be back on the Investigative Journal with more about the sinking of the Titanic and its sinking of America. Back in 3 minutes.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet. or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour, and let's get right back to the sinking of the Titanic and the story behind it regarding the Federal Reserve System. The one you're not going to get if you go to the movies and watch it. You're not even going to get the real story in the history books. Now, they're building this unsinkable ship. J.P. Morgan was ordered to do it by the Jesuits. These rich and powerful men would have been able to block the establishment that they were going to be on the ship. They had to be destroyed by any means, and no one would suspect the Jesuits. The Titanic was the vehicle of their destruction. In order to further shield the papacy and the Jesuits from suspicion, they put many Irish Roman Catholics and French and Italians on board. So people would think, well, it wasn't them. I mean, they wouldn't kill their own. Oh, yes, they would. All the wealthy and powerful men the Jesuits wanted to get rid of were invited to take the cruise. 3 of the richest and most important of these were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the head of Macy's department stores, and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world. Their total wealth at the time, using dollar values of their day, was more than $500 million. Today, that amount would be worth nearly $11 billion. These three men were coaxed and encouraged to board the floating palace. They had to be destroyed because the Jesuits knew they would use their wealth and influence to oppose any Federal Reserve Bank, as well as the various wars that were being planned at the time. So they had to be destroyed somehow. Astor was the wealthiest man aboard the Titanic and was the original owner of the famous Empire State Building in New York City. Edward Smith was the captain of the Titanic, and he had been traveling the North Atlantic waters for more than 26 years and was the world's most experienced master of the North Atlantic routes. He had worked for Jesuit J.P. Morgan for many years. Edward Smith was a Jesuit, basically working for the Jesuits. This means that he was not a priest, but was a Jesuit of, maybe they call it the short robe. Jesuits are not necessarily priests. Those who are not priests serve the order through the profession. Anyone could be a Jesuit, and their identity would not be known. Edward Smith served the order in his profession as a sea captain. Now, many interesting points about the Titanic are discussed in a videotape made by National Geographic in 1986. The videotape is entitled The Secrets of the Titanic. Now, when the Titanic departed from southern England on April 10, 1912, Francis Brown, the Jesuit master of Edward Smith, boarded the Titanic. This man was the most powerful Jesuit in all of Ireland and answered directly to the general of the Jesuit order in Rome. The videotape declares this: a vacationing priest, Father Francis Brown, caught these poignant snapshots of his fellow passengers, most of them on a voyage to eternity. The next day, the Titanic made her last stop off the coast of Queenstown, Ireland. Here, tenders brought out the last passengers, mostly Irish immigrants headed for new homes in America. And here the lucky Father Brown disembarked. Father Brown caught Captain Smith peering down from the Titanic's bridge, poised on the brink of destiny. The Secrets of the Titanic, and that was in National Geographic. Now, here's the Jesuit treachery at its finest, folks. The provincial Father Francis Brown boards the Titanic, photographs the victims, most assuredly briefs the captain concerning his oath as a Jesuit, and following morning bids him farewell. Okay. Now, that's in fact taken from Vatican Assassins. Okay. I was sent this article. Now, Brown went over with Edward Smith one last time exactly what he was supposed to do in the North Atlantic waters. The Jesuit general told Francis Brown what was to happen. Brown then tells Smith the rest is history. Edward Smith believed that the Jesuit general, is the god of the Jesuit society, and nothing but his electric touch can galvanize their dead corpses into life and action until he speaks. They are like serpents coiled up in the wintry graves, lifeless and inactive. But the moment he gives the word of command, each member springs instantaneously to his feet, leaving unfinished whatsoever may have engaged him, ready to assail whomsoever he may require to be assailed, and to strike wheresoever he shall direct a blow to be stricken. That's from R.W. Thompson, The Footprints of the Jesuits. Edward Smith was given an order to sink the Titanic, and that is exactly what he did. By the command of God, the Jesuit general, it is lawful to murder the innocent, to rob, to commit all lewdness, because he, the Pope, is the Lord of life and death and of all things, and thus to fulfill his mandate is our duty. W.C. Brownlee's Secret Instructions of the Jesuits. Now, there is no record in history of an association whose organization has stood for 300 years, unchanged and unaltered, by all the assaults of men in time, and which has exercised such an immense influence over the destinies of mankind. Now do you know why I cover this story? The ends justify the means is their favorite maxim. And his only end, as we have shown, is in the order. At its bidding, the Jesuit is ready to commit any crime whatsoever. G.B. Nicolini, The History of the Jesuits. Let us remember the oath that every person takes to become part of a Jesuit order. And let's just read part of it. I should regard myself as a dead body, without will and intelligence, as a little crucifix which is turned about unresistingly at the will of him who holds it in his staff and in the hands of an old man, who uses it as he requires and as it suits him best. That's from R.W. Thompson again. When a person takes the oath, he is bound to his master until the day he dies. Edward Smith had become a man without will or intelligence. He would commit any crime the order wanted him to commit. Smith had been required for martyrdom. On board the Titanic that night, Smith knew his duty. He was under oath. The ship had been built for the enemies of the Jesuits. After 3 days at sea, with only one pair of glasses for the bridge, Edward Smith propelled the Titanic full speed ahead, 22 knots on a moonless night through a gigantic ice field, nearly 8 square miles in area. You don't go 22 knots in that kind of ice field. Edward Smith did this despite at least 8 telegrams warning him to be more cautious because he was going too fast. Did Smith need one caution? No, he had been traveling those waters for 26 years. He knew there were icebergs in the area, but 8 cautions did not stop this man who was under the Jesuit oath and under orders to destroy the Titanic. The absurdity of warning veteran Captain Smith repeatedly on the Titanic's dredge at night to slow down is nothing short of preposterous. The fact that Smith never listened or heeded the warnings is insane. He had been given orders from his God in the Vatican, and nothing would turn him off his course. The encyclopedias paint a very tragic picture of Smith in his last hours. When it came time to give the order to load and lower the lifeboat, Smith wavered, and one of his aides had to approach him for the order to be given. Smith's legendary skills of leadership seemed to have left him all of a sudden. He was curiously indecisive and unusually cautious on that fatal night. Are these words to describe a legendary sea captain with 26 years of experience? Or as these words to describe a man who was struggling in his mind whether he should do his duty as a captain or obey the master who had told him to sink the ship? John Jacob Astor's wife got into a lifeboat and was saved, while John Jacob Astor perished in the waters off the North Atlantic. There were not enough lifeboats, and many of them were only half full with only women and children. To prevent nearby freighters from responding with help, the distress flares were white when they should have been red. White flares, let me see, I lost my place here. But they should have been red flares. Instead of, they put up white flares. Now, white flares to passing freighters state that everybody was having a party. One of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, the sinking of the Titanic, lies at the door of the Jesuit order. The unsinkable ship, the floating palace, was created to be a tomb for the wealthy, who opposed the Federal Reserve System. By 1912, all opposition to the Federal Reserve was eliminated. In December 1913, the Federal Reserve System came into being in the United States. 8 months later, the Jesuits had sufficient funding through the Federal Reserve Bank to begin World War I. Isn't that interesting? Oh boy. Now, I want to mention one thing. We did a lot of stories about the sinking of the Titanic, and one that strikes me as important. A person did a lot of research. There were 2 ships built, a sister ship that was just about like the Titanic, and it was damaged, severely damaged in an accident. And to save insurance money, there's a whole big story about the possibility that the Titanic actually wasn't the Titanic when they switched the ships, just so that they could then, the other ship would then be in perfect condition, and one of the 2 ships would still be able to make money. And there was a huge insurance claim that somehow was being finagled. So there is a good amount of research on, actually they might have switched the ships, but we'll leave that for another day. Let's go back to... now, look at this. All these people, Vandercliff, Rockefellers, Davidson, Norton, J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, are traitors to the American people, traitors to the American flag and its Constitution. These men sold their citizenship to Rome instead of their allegiance to the United States. And how many politicians in high-level positions have done the same? We know Trump has. We know Obama has. We know Clinton has. We know that Bush has had. And we can keep going back and back and back. Now, remember that the Rockefellers and Rothschilds belong to the 13 satanic Illuminati bloodlines. Illuminati, a satanic secret brotherhood, society established by a Jesuit named Adam Weishaupt at the Jesuits University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, Germany on May 1, 1776. Now, Father Brown photograph collection contains the soul of the Titanic photographs taken during the Titanic passage from Southampton to Ireland. From 1911 to 1916, Frank Brown studied theology at Milltown Park, Dublin. It was during this period that his uncle Robert, Bishop of Cloyne, sent him an unusual present, a ticket for the first legs of a maiden voyage of the Titanic, sailing from Southampton to Cherbourg, and then to Queenstown, County Cork, Ireland. While on board, an American millionaire offered to pay his way for the rest of the voyage to New York. On being apprised on this suggestion, Frank's Jesuit Superior General cabled Queenstown saying succinctly, "Get off that ship, provincial." Right, because Father Francis Brown is the provincial superior of the Jesuits in Ireland, and off that ship because the Jesuits and he himself will sink the Titanic deliberately as planned. After the tragedy, Father Brown's Frank Brown photographs appeared on the front pages of newspapers all around the world. He had taken the last picture of Captain Smith and the only man ever taken into the Marconi room. Okay. Now, on April 15th, 1912, the Jesuit order sunk the Titanic, killing John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, the three major players who opposed the Federal Reserve Bank. Where were the other people on there? Morgan and those guys. They weren't there. Exactly 1 year after the Titanic sunk in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, like I said, the Federal Reserve Bank was established, ready to finance the Russian Communist Revolution, which talks about, we were just talking about the reduction of Paraguay reductions and how the Jesuits perfected communism. They needed money, ready to finance this, Western money. According to Thomas Schaff, Dear American, he says, "Pursuant to your request, I will attempt to clear up questions you have about the Federal Reserve. I spent much time," this guy says, "researching the Fed, and these are the shocking and revealing conclusions." Let's look a little bit at what he found here. Pursuant to, the Federal Reserve is a private company. Who actually owns the Federal Reserve central banks? The ownership of the 12 central banks, a very well-kept secret, has been revealed. Let's look at it. Rothschild Bank of London, Warburg Bank of Hamburg, Rothschild Bank of Berlin, Lehman Brothers of New York, Lazard Brothers of Paris, Kuhn Loeb Bank of New York, Israel Moses Self Banks of Italy, Goldman Sachs of New York, Warburg Bank of Amsterdam, Chase Manhattan Bank of New York. Now please keep in mind, the House of Rothschild is the banker and the guardian of the Vatican Treasury, their wealth. Under the Black Papacy, the Jesuit Superior General, honest and reliable, what historian knew it a long time. Now, Congressman Louis T. McFadden's speech on the Federal Reserve System. Let's see what he has to say. He says the Federal Reserve is a corrupt institution. Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions of the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks, hereinafter called the Fed. The Fed has cheated the government of these United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the nation's debt back. The depredations and inequities of the Fed has cost enough money to pay the national debt back several times. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, has bankrupted itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Fed, and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Some people who think that the Federal Reserve banks, United States government institutions, they are private monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers, foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers, and rich and predatory moneylenders. In that dark crew of financial pirates, they are those who would cut a man's throat to get $1 out of his pocket. There are those who send money into states to buy votes to control our legislatures. There are those who maintain international propaganda for the purpose of deceiving us into granting of new concessions which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds and set again in motion this gigantic train of crime. These 12 private credit monopolies were deceitfully and disloyally foisted up upon this country by the bankers who came here from Europe and repaid us our hospitality by undermining our American institutions. These bankers took money out of this country to finance Japan in the war against Russia. They created a reign of terror in Russia with our money in order to help that war along. They instigated the separate peace between Germany and Russia and thus drove a wedge between the Allies in World War. They financed Trotsky's passage from New York to Russia so that he might assist in the destruction of the Russian Empire. They fomented and instigated the Russian Revolution and placed a large fund of American dollars at Trotsky's disposal in one of their branch banks in Sweden, so that through him Russian homes might be thoroughly broken up and Russian children flung far and wide from their natural protectors. They have since begun breaking up of American homes and the dispersal of American children. Mr. Chairman, there should be no partnership in matters concerning banking and currency affairs in this country, and I do not speak with any. In 1912, the National Monetary Association, under the chairmanship of the late Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, made a report and presented a vicious bill called the National Reserve Association Bill. This bill is usually spoken of as the Aldrich Bill. Senator Aldrich did not write the Aldrich Bill. He was a tool, if not the accomplice of the European bankers, for nearly 20 years had been scheming to set up a central bank in this country, who in 1912 and were continuing to spend vast sums of money to accomplish their purpose. We were opposed to Aldrich's plan from the beginning for this central bank. The men who ruled the Democratic Party then promised the people that if they were returned to power, there would be no central bank established here while they held the reins of government. 13 months later, that promise was broken, and the Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood behind the Colonel House, established here in our free country the worm-eaten monarchical institution of the King's Bank to control us from top downward and from the cradle to the grave. The Federal Reserve Bank destroyed our old and characteristic way of doing business. It discriminated against our one-name commercial paper, now the finest in the world, and it set up the antiquated two-name paper, which is the present curse of this country and which wrecked every country which has ever given it scope. It fastened down upon the country the very tyranny from which the framers of the Constitution sought to save us from. Now, the above information will shatter the foundation of any of this stuff. You got to look at this information because, indeed, Jesuits are the secret entity that perfected the tenets of communism, the reductions of Paraguay, and also the masterminds behind making sure that this country would be destroyed through the Federal Reserve System. Now, then we talked about the Jesuit order tutoring Karl Marx concerning tenets of communism inside the British Museum in 1848. The Jesuits tutored him from Marx for more than 30 years. Lenin was trained by the Jesuit order in Geneva, Switzerland, and it was Diego Bergam, Germany's ambassador to the Vatican during Germany's Weimar Republic and during Hitler's Nazi Germany, that provided transport from Lenin into Russia via Vatican sealed trains. And the Jesuits were behind Stalin. And Joseph Stalin was trained by the Jesuits inside the Orthodox Seminary in Tiflis, Georgia, in Russia. Together with Stalin was Cardinal Agajanian. And he turns up in the concentration camps. He was one of the top people in the Stalin regime. It matches from Congressman McFadden's speech in the U.S. Congress that the Jesuits established the Federal Reserve Bank, financed communist revolution in Russia. Below are more speeches from Congress that we have here. Louis McFadden inside the U.S. State Congress. Due to the expose of Congressman McFadden, there were so many attempts in his life from his colleagues in the Congress, and few historians did mention that Congressman McFadden died due to poison, the Jesuits' poison cup. So once he uttered those words, that was his death sentence. The establishment, and guess what? JFK wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve Bank. That's what killed him too, one of the reasons. Now the establishment of this bank was a Jesuit order's masterpiece. The sinking of the Titanic is a Jesuit's treachery at its finest. When it comes to well-hidden dark secrets, world historical events, few honest and reliable historians knew it well. Millions of people around the world, even the most intellectual, presidents, prime ministers, senators, congressmen, ministers, businessmen, TV and radio reporters, media personnel, showbiz personality, elite and rich families, university professors, teachers, military, and police officers, professionals, are unaware of these facts. Many are. There are many that are. Without in-depth knowledge of this history, it will be difficult for them to connect all the dots. And so you people that understand it are very lucky. Even up to the present time, millions of innocent American people are betrayed victims without their slightest knowledge that their Federal Reserve Bank is privately owned, secretly created by the Jesuits, fronting proxies under the pocket payment. Since the beginning of the Jesuit order's conception in 1540 up to this present time, the Jesuit order, the Roman Catholic Church, is the most powerful entity in the world. In-depth knowledge of world history is one of the best ways to detect the elusiveness and the invincibility of the Jesuits. Even the so-called most powerful nation in the world, the United States, the Jesuits have successfully established the Federal Reserve Bank. How much more a third world country? Also, as per world history, the Bank of America and Lockheed Martin, aviation space defense contractor, are primarily owned by the Jesuits. No political event or circumstance can be evaluated without the knowledge of the Vatican as part of it. And no significant world situation exists in which the Vatican does not play an important or explicit role. That was from Avro Manhattan, The Vatican in World Politics. Now, whoever will disagree that the Vatican was not involved in the past and present day worldwide politics is despising her own knowledge of understanding and closing his eyes and ears. Let the truth flow. All pictures, many of these things need to be discussed, and an open discussion on the Federal Reserve. Back to Monday on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.